Hello and welcome to the Clashing of Steel. Today I will be talking about flanking. Flanking is vital for defeating opponents. With a bit of luck and correct flanking tactics, you can rout a single opponent with 2 units. It might not always work, and there are some things that players should know. So, one of the first and main things is to spread out. That way, if you are spread out, you can handle a blob of opponents with 1 unit. This guy went in with all 3, the blob versus blob. So I'm seeing an opening that I must use. I'm sending one of my units in from the rear into that blob with proscription, and 2 of my units around them to flank. Personally, I would suggest someone with the charge ability to be a flanking unit, because if you charge in from the rear, the impact damage will be huge. So the second tip is not to use formations when you are flanking. You don't want your unit to be formed. You want it to be as spread as possible. Formations usually keep your units in a single line. With it, they can't spread so widely. Another thing you can do is push a bit into the opponent. That means if you see that few of your soldiers are only engaged and the rest are waiting behind, just press behind the opponent you're trying to flank, so that your unit will try to go through, and when they reach the opponent, press on the opponent so that they would attack. Sometimes that way your units will try to swarm the opponent a bit better and even do a bit more flanking than you expect. Probably the best way you can flank is if you come in from the rear, directly the rear, not from the sides but directly from the rear. That way you have the biggest chance to cover the opponent's sides and the rear. It can be excellently done with spearmen. If you spread spearmen out and are playing, for example, Miltiades, you can charge in from the rear, covering all of the opponent's sides and rear. Actually, I have seen how Miltiades players have failed with the flanking. The problem there was, they could have swarmed me every way they would have wanted, but I always turn towards them. If somebody is flanking me, I suspect they have charge usually, and that is why I turn towards them. If they charge into me from the front, they will do significantly less damage. And since that guy was playing Miltiades, the unit I engaged was in phalanx, and the unit that tried to come in from the rear was in free mode or breaking ranks formation. That gave me an excellent chance to block all of their flanking attempts. All of his mistakes were deploying phalanx. You must try to swarm the opponent the best you can. He was literally around me. He could have just swarmed me if he would have undeployed the phalanx. Another thing that can happen when you are flanking opponent is that 2 units won't rout him. If there is a third one nearby, for example some cavalry or some other melee units, he can always try to support you from the other side or from the rear or from whatever direction is yet opened. This type of situation can happen even with Miltiades, when Miltiades is swarming the opponent all around them, but for some reason the sides or the rear is not considered flanked. So if you're playing cavalry, for example, and seeing that 2 units are trying to flank 1 unit and the morale bar is not reducing, you can always try and send 1 unit in and help them flank. There are quite few ways you can flank, but there are a lot of ways you can support flanking. I'm not saying you need to swarm opponents, but it can sometimes work, yeah. In best case scenario, you're with melee units and come in from different directions from behind the opponent. And in worst case, you're either archers, javelins or something like that, and you are trying to hit the opponent from behind. Meaning that you have run around the opponent and now are weakening them for the fighting unit, or even engaging them in melee just to do some moral damage. With whatever units you're playing, you can do some flanking maneuvers or some flanking damage. It doesn't always have to rout the opponent, but it must do some sort of damage to be quite successful. I do not suggest doing it with siege equipment, because it can often destroy your teammates. If you are ever nearby and see that your team member is flanking somebody and it isn't working out or they are not routing, you can always try and give it a shot. You might always want to check what opponent you're dealing with, left click on them and see what commander they are. If it's Vercingetorix, well, he can freeze his morale and be unshakable for around 40 seconds. Flanking maneuvers might not always rout your opponents, but they will force them to fight on 2 lines at the same time, so giving you a better chance to defeat them. Although as said, in the best case scenario, you will still rout them. And if you are nearby, seeing that your teammate can't handle a unit, can't rout them, you can always try and give them a little bit support. So these were the basics of flanking. Most of these are just actions that are best taken, best considered by you, your teammates and so on. With ranged units, be very careful when going around the opponents and firing them in the back, because it can often end up firing your own friendly units. There is no point in doing it if there are very little opponents left, but if there is a whole group, usually firing them in the back and destroy them rather fast, and this way your engaged team member will take significantly less damage than you shooting over him. As I said, there are many different ways you can support flanking. It doesn't always have to route, it can work in many ways, but I'm sure you can try it out yourself. Anyways, don't forget to subscribe and thanks for watching.